Growing up in Canada, sweet corn season was always one of my favorite times of the year, and we always used to eat lots of corn on the cob during that period of time in late summer and early autumn. And this is something that I've really missed since I moved to Ireland. Sweet corn, as it's known over here, is just not really available except in frozen form, and it's hard to grow. I've always assumed that the summers here in Ireland are just not warm enough to grow this heat-loving crop. But last year we grew some sweet corn in 2 of the polytunnels, and it was more successful than I would have expected. This year we grew several batches of sweet corn undercover, and we also grew some sweet corn in the ground outside and in containers outside. And although there were definitely some issues, we were able to produce a lot of sweet corn. Ireland has a cool maritime climate that is dominated by our position in the North Atlantic, with lots of rain and a fair amount of wind, and without more extreme temperatures in both the summer and the winter. Daytime high temperatures in the summer typically stay below 20 degrees Celsius, and the nighttime temperatures often drop below 10 degrees Celsius. We do get warmer spells most years, often lasting for several weeks, but they're not so reliable, and they often seem to happen earlier in the summer. Sweet corn generally prefers significantly warmer growing conditions. It would grow here, but it would grow very slowly, and because it's also not very tolerant to frosts, we don't necessarily have a long enough frost-free growing season to be able to produce ripe cobs. I do grow other crops that are similar to this, including squash and pumpkins, which are marginal crops in this climate, but I have to supply some extra protection in the spring and generally have to grow very fast or quick maturing varieties, at least outside. In the polytunnel, things are different, not only because it generally extends a frost-free growing season. There's generally warmer conditions for growing, especially during the day, and usually a bit warmer at night. We grow a lot of tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, and other heat-loving crops in the polytunnels, usually selecting crops that are both high value and high yielding in order to justify taking up so much of this relatively scarce growing space. And until recently, I didn't think that sweet corn was high yielding enough for the amount of space that it would take up in the polytunnels. Last year, we extended the covered growing space by putting up another large polytunnel, so I felt we finally had the space to try growing some sweet corn. And we grew a fair amount of it, with 2 batches of open pollinated varieties in 2 of the polytunnels. Corn is such a fascinating crop, and it's really interesting to see how different it is to all of the other crops that we grow. The plants grew quickly and tall as expected, with the tassels pressed up against the plastic at the top of the polytunnel, even in the taller polytunnel, and this caused some overshadowing of adjacent crops. We grew about 130 plants in the 2 spaces, and although not all the plants produced a cob, we still had a lot of cobs to eat fresh and to freeze for later, which was great. We had sown the seeds in mid-April and transplanted them into the polytunnel bed in early May, and we were able to harvest the first ripe cobs in early August and able to enjoy them fresh for almost 3 weeks. So it took about 110 days from sowing the seeds until the first ripe cob was ready for harvest, which is about 2 weeks longer than the days to maturity that is specified with the varieties that we grew. So it's definitely possible to grow sweet corn in a polytunnel like this, even if it is a bit cramped. We grew a lot of sweet corn again this year, both in the polytunnels and outside, but we ended up sowing the seeds a bit later in the spring, mainly to allow the other crops to mature first. But I think that this was probably not a good idea. In the large polytunnel, we grew a hybrid variety, sowing 2 batches of seeds at the middle of May and the beginning of June, which delayed the harvest until the end of August and well into September. A lot of the plants of this variety produced more than 1 cob, and although the second cob was a bit smaller, we ended up with more cobs and a slightly higher yield than last year in roughly the same space. I didn't like waiting so long to be able to harvest the corn from this batch, and the plants seemed to struggle a bit with the decreasing temperatures of August and the shortening days. This might have contributed to the infestation of spider mites that the plants got later in the season, which I didn't catch in time. But we still had a decent crop with a lot of corn to eat, though it could have been a bit better and earlier. With the older and smaller polytunnel, I decided to fill it with a trial of the Three Sisters this year, which is a companion planting of corn, squash, and beans that was developed and used by some of the indigenous peoples of North America. I haven't tried this type of companion planting before, and it's hard to find details about plant density and how the three different crops relate to each other, especially for a polytunnel here in Ireland. I ended up planting clusters of 4 sweetcorn plants, spaced a reasonable distance apart, with the beans sown in a little bit later at the base of these clusters, and the squash and the pumpkin plants transplanted into the edge of the polytunnel to allow the vines to grow in to cover the full ground. All the plants grew well, and they ended up growing so much that they overcrowded most of the polytunnel space, with the sweetcorn plants losing out. The climbing beans eventually grew up all of the corn plants and continued to grow to form a cluster of vines high up in the polytunnel, overshadowing the plants, and some of the corn stalks were pulled over by the weight of the developing pods. And some of the squash plants were really vigorous and ended up climbing up and over the sweetcorn plants. And I ended up cutting back a lot of the vines of the squash in order to give the sweetcorn a little bit more space. We did get a harvest of corn cobs, though some of them were hard to find. But with all of the plants being crowded out and the overshadowing, it was not a big crop. Most of the cobs were well developed, full of kernels of corn. But there were some pollination issues with some gaps in kernels developing in some of the cobs, as I think a lot of the pollen would have fallen into the space between the clusters of corn plants. In the space beside this polytunnel, I decided to try a planting of the 3 sisters outside. As expected, this was not so successful in this climate, but at least the sweetcorn plants were not overcrowded by the beans and squash plants, which didn't do so well in the cool conditions. And the soil in this part of the ground was not so developed and probably could have used a lot more fertility. There were also pollination issues, more than in the polytunnel, with the wind blowing the pollen from the tops of the plants and missing a lot of the silks that were developing at the ends of the cobs, leading to big gaps in the kernels of the cobs and a lot less to eat. The first batch of this open pollinated variety was sown at the beginning of May and transplanted 3 weeks later, but we had to wait until well into September to harvest the first cobs. This was over 140 days from sowing to harvesting, which is a lot longer than the 90 days to maturity that people in warmer climates can apparently expect when growing this variety. In order to get a better crop, I think I'd need to sow earlier and at a higher density of corn plants than is probably useful in a companion planting of the 3 sisters. And better soil fertility and a faster maturing variety would probably help as well. But we were able to eat sweet corn growing outside in Ireland in a summer that didn't have great weather, though the temperature on average was a bit warmer than we would typically expect, except for the important month of July. We also grew another batch of sweet corn in 16 large grow bags outside, transplanting 3 plants in mid-June into the large bags filled with a heavily fertilized growing medium, using the same hybrid variety that we had grown in the larger polytunnel. I didn't expect much from these plants, as I didn't know if sweet corn would even grow in containers or grow outside. But the plants grew well, especially when I liquid fed them a few times, and I was pleasantly surprised to see quite a few cobs developing, which we were able to harvest from mid-September through to the beginning of October. These plants seemed shorter and the stand seemed more dense than the same variety growing inside the polytunnel, and the cobs seemed smaller, but there were more of them per plant, possibly because they were growing out in the open with nothing else overshadowing them. We were able to harvest a few cobs from a lot of the plants, and most of these cobs seemed quite similar in size and reasonably well developed, full of kernels, though there were a few instances of pollination issues. I think this might have been the most successful crop of corn that we grew this year, and it was relatively easy to manage and to water with the new dripper system that I had installed. And the plants seemed to be able to get enough fertility despite the constrained root systems, and there was no obvious signs of pest or disease issues. It took about 3 weeks longer for these cobs to ripen outside, as the same hybrid variety did growing inside the polytunnel, which is not as long as I expected. And I wonder if the warmer growing medium in the grow bags would have helped to speed up the growth of the plants. Looking at the numbers, we were able to harvest about 74 well-developed cobs of sweet corn from these 48 plants growing in the 16 large grow bags, which took up about 8 square meters of space, which is more sweet corn than I thought we would be able to harvest. With all these different plantings and despite all the issues, we were able to eat a lot of sweet corn. And I learned a lot, but there are more questions and things that I want to learn, which is always a really interesting part about learning how to grow a crop, especially one that doesn't grow so well in this context. Selecting faster maturing varieties, or more specifically, varieties that will mature faster in a cooler climate, will make a lot of difference and is perhaps more important than higher yielding varieties. There's also the difference between the varieties with a normal sugar content and the super sweet varieties, which is partially a personal preference, but it also restricts the possibilities of doing variety trials because of cross-pollination issues. Planting earlier in the season would definitely help, allowing the cobs to ripen during the warmer part of the season, but it would also be good to explore succession planting or to plant varieties with different maturing times to stretch out the harvests over a longer part of the summer and early autumn. I will definitely be growing sweet corn outside again, as I have a lot more space available to dedicate to this crop. But I'll be planting earlier in the spring and making sure that I use covers to protect from the frost to either extend the growing season or to get an earlier crop. It would also be interesting to explore growing in containers again, as this was more successful than I thought it would be. I would like to grow sweet corn as part of the Three Sisters planting again next year, especially to explore issues of spacing and timing, but I'm not sure if I have the space available with all of the other things that I want to explore. I'm not sure about growing sweet corn in the polytunnel again, even though I can get a bigger and earlier crop. As the more sweet corn that I grow in these tight spaces, the less other crops I can fit in, and the difference in yield is significant. From the batches of sweet corn that we grew in the one polytunnel this year, I calculated that we harvested about 11 cobs per square meter, which weighed about 4 kilograms. But only about half of that is edible kernels, so the edible yield is closer to 2 kilograms per square meter from a crop that occupies this valuable growing space for the main part of the growing season. 2 kilograms is not a lot, especially compared to the 15 kilograms of tomatoes or 8 kilograms of beans or 30 kilograms of cucumbers that I could grow in the same amount of space. And all of these heat-loving tall crops don't grow nearly as well or at all outside here in Ireland, and they're much easier to support by hanging from the polytunnel structure. But apparently we can grow sweet corn outside here in Ireland, which was a pleasant surprise for me. So if polytunnel space is scarce, it makes more sense to grow these tall, self-supporting plants outside. But I think I might try to find some space in one of the polytunnels for this crop, as I think we're a long way from having too much sweet corn. I'm obviously not filming this from my gardens in Ireland, as I'm currently visiting my family in Canada. But I'll be back in the gardens in a few days, and we'll be busy harvesting crops for storage, clearing up the gardens, and planting in some overwintering crops. There are lots of videos that I want to make about a wide range of different crops that we grew this past year, and it will take quite a few months to work through all of this content. If you like these videos and appreciate the type of explorations that I do in these gardens, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of these upcoming videos. And if you want to support this channel even more and to help with all of the different explorations, there are links to my Patreon and PayPal account in the video description below. The more support and engagement that I get with this channel, the more I will be able to explore as part of this Red Gardens project. But most importantly, thank you for watching.